My name is Brad Gregory. I teach in the history department here at Notre Dame, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you at this first afternoon session a speaker and a scholar who I'm sure is familiar to a great many of you for his important work on issues pertaining to Catholic social thought, Catholic moral theology and philosophy, natural law and society, focused broadly on the ways in which Catholic thought has both responded to and continues to offer challenges to the complex situation created by the rise of modern secular institutions, cultural assumptions, and moral values in the past 2 centuries in particular. Professor Russell Hittinger, our guest speaker this afternoon, holds the Warren Chair of Catholic Studies at the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma, where he has been since 1996 and is concurrently professor of law. He has also taught at Fordham and the Catholic University of America, has been a visiting professor at Princeton, NYU, and the Charles University in Prague. This academic year, he is the Robert J. Randall Distinguished Visiting Professor in Christian Culture at Providence College. Professor Hittinger's single-authored books include A Critique of the New Natural Law Theory, published in 1987, and The First Grace, Rediscovering Natural Law in a Post-Christian Age, which appeared in 2003 and has also been translated into Italian. His multiple current book projects include one dealing with modern Catholic teachings on nature in marriage, as well as one on papal views on secular authority from the French Revolution to the present. Professor Hittinger sits on numerous academic boards and councils. He's given many prestigious invited lectures in the United States and Canada, as well as in other countries, including Italy, Poland, the Slovak Republic, France, Austria, Spain, and Azerbaijan, a trend which continues. This coming May, he will give the keynote address at the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences in Rome entitled Personhood of Society and the State, Subsidiarity or Devolution. Before introducing the title of his talk this afternoon, it would be remiss were I not to mention what is perhaps the most important line on his CV, namely, B.A., University of Notre Dame, summa cum laude. But we will not ask him, I've decided, to sing the alma mater with us before his talk this afternoon. In all seriousness, it is a pleasure to introduce to you Professor Russell Hittinger and this afternoon's lecture entitled Two Modernisms, Two Thomisms, Reflections on the Centenary of Pius X's Letter Against the Modernists. Professor Russell Hittinger.
This paper was supposed to have been given last year. Some of you may know that. Last year David had the conference on modernism, and I got caught in snow. And we agreed I'd just show up this year and give the paper. It gave me another 12 months to work on it. And I won't even try to make it fit with diversity. But this is, after all, the centenary of the encyclical Pascendi, summer 2007. So it's just as well that someone has something to say about it. You will find no reference to it in any of the documents of the Second Vatican Council, nor does it make even a cameo appearance in the document Dominus Jesu, which was issued by the Holy Office in 2000 and which addressed theological problems which could have been lifted right out of the pages of Pascendi. This fall, 3 of the Catholic ecclesiastical papers posted brief stories on the anniversary. L'Osservatore Romano, La Civiltà Cattolica, and Avvenire admitted that Pius's condemnation was on the right track, but that it caused more problems than it solved. End of story. This is the conventional wisdom, and truth in advertising, I don't disagree with it. But perhaps I can shed some light on the controversy by coming at it obliquely from a different set of questions and from a different history. The condemnation of modernism actually appeared in 2 documents in the summer of 1907. The Roman Inquisition published the Decretum Lamentabile Sane in July of 1907, containing a syllabus of some 65 modernist propositions. Okay. 2 months later, under his own name, Pius X issued the encyclical Pascendi, on the doctrines of the Modernists. He admitted in the encyclical that his exposition would prove unusually prolix and didactic. But this was necessary to deal with modernism as a whole system, indeed as the synthesis of all heresies. In January 1908, the Dublin Review published an editorial on the encyclical. The editor, Wilfred Ward, immediately proffered obedience to the Holy See, at least to what he called the act of the Holy See condemning the doctrine of the Modernists. It's on? Ward, however, was not pleased with what he called the document. He complained that it left too vague the origin, definition, and scope of modernism. It was clear enough, he conceded, that the Pope wished to condemn the principle of subjectivism in religion. So stated, modernism would seem to be nothing other than generic liberalism in matters of religion and theology, and in England, that issue had been turned over quite a few times by 1907. Presciently, Ward worried that the term modernism would draw into its net a millennium of Catholic intellectual labor devoted to reconciling the moderni, the new authors, books, ideas, devotions, with the antiqui, with its authors, books, and ideas. For example, this is a very telling example. Pius X quoted Gregory IX's letter written in 1223 about certain nefarious moderni at the University of Paris, suggesting that the precedent for modernism was the reception of Aristotle among the Parisian masters. In point of fact, Pope Gregory supported Aristotelian scholasticism and had criticized only certain translations and commentaries of an Averroistic bent. Now, the reader of the Dublin Review in January 1908 would have understood the problem that was being raised so delicately by the editor. In 1879, Leo XIII issued Aeterni Patris, calling for a revival of scholastic philosophy and theology. Leo insisted that the Catholic mind ought to do just what the careless reader of Pascendi might construe as forbidden, namely to harmonize the modern sciences with scholastic philosophy. Leo proclaimed, the best parent and guardian of liberty among men is truth. The proper response to the moderni is critical openness to truth and to all of the sciences. Thomas's philosophy, he believed, provided the best combination of core principles and synthetic reach on the disputed issues of modern times. Regarding the normativity of Thomas's thought, Leo wrote, while we hold that every word of wisdom, every useful thing, by whomsoever discovered or planned ought to be received with a willing and grateful mind, we exhort you, venerable brethren, in all earnestness, to restore the golden wisdom of St. Thomas, and to spread it far and wide for the defense and beauty of the Catholic faith, for the good of society, and for the advantage of all the sciences. It's not the microphone, is it? The wisdom of St. Thomas, we say, for if anything is taken up with too great subtlety by the scholastic doctors, or too carelessly stated, if there be anything ill that agrees with the discoveries of a later age, or in a word, improbable in whatever way, it does not enter our mind to propose that for imitation in our age. Let carefully selected teachers endeavor to implant the doctrine of St. Thomas in the minds of students and set forth his solidity and excellence over others. Be ye watchful that the doctrine of St. Thomas, drawn from his own fountains, or at least from those rivulets which derive from that very fount, have thus far flowed according to the established agreement of learned men, pure and clear, unquote. Ward did not mention, and perhaps he did not even notice, that Pius IX quoted only the sentence regarded too great subtlety of the scholastic doctors. Completely left out in Pascendi is the opening exhortation regarding receptivity to truth, by whomsoever planned or discovered. Pius also elides Leo's explicit recognition that Thomas is mediated through traditions, or these rivulets, which need to be discerned with regard to the fount. In other words, Leo's program looked backward from the traditions to the original and forward toward a constructive engagement with modern philosophy and science. For his part, Pius X moves directly to a disciplinary matter. Seminary professors, he says, may not disparage or set aside Thomas, especially in metaphysical questions. Praesertim in re metaphysica. What accounts for these different points of view? Pius X made it clear that the adversaries of Catholicism are now not from without, but from within. Along with its disciplinary apparatus, Pascendi treats the Moderni as an intestine disorder to be purged from the bowels of the church, using his own image, and then only with great difficulty, because, to switch the metaphor, this cancer has what Pius X calls a manifold personality. Pius X is concerned not merely to distinguish true from false philosophy, but to detect true from false churchmen. Thomism was brought into the center of that diagnostic task. While Leo and Pius certainly agreed on the practical conclusion that Thomas ought to be taught and privileged in institutions of ecclesiastical formation, we cannot ignore their quite different conceptions of how the Catholic and Thomistic mind ought to situate and dispose itself toward modernity. This afternoon, I want to argue that the differences between Aeterni Patris and Pascendi contain in nucleo not only a tension between a constructive and synthetic Thomism on the one hand and a legislated or disciplinary Thomism on the other. Deeper still was another tension, best understood in terms of two different aspects of modernity with which Catholicism had to reckon. The two are interlaced and therefore are not capable of being separated, but they can be distinguished. For our purposes, the first modernity is social, economic, political, and legal. We are speaking of those aspects of modern life that made necessary the development of what came to be called social doctrine. How should Catholics live in a world in which political Christendom is defunct? Both chronologically and in the lived experience of Catholics, this cluster of questions came first. The second theme is modernity as a philosophical system that displaced or at least threatened what could be called the preambles of the faith. Truths known in principle by natural reason, particularly on issues having a propinquity to sacred theology. They can be summarized in the pithy remark by Pius X in reference to the obligation of seminary professors to adhere to Thomas' Praesertim in re metaphysica. Thus, the title of this essay, Two Modernisms, Two Thomisms. Beginning in the 19th century, there emerged two distinct sets of problems for which Thomism was to provide the remedy. Leo's project included both, but with a decided emphasis on the social and political. Pius X included both, but with an even more decided emphasis on the philosophy officially needed ad intra to buttress sacred doctrine within the ranks of the church. To prepare ourselves for this discussion, it's necessary to take a bird's eye view of the historical events in response to which modernity became a Catholic problem, and what is more, a problem to be understood in Thomistic terms. Among other things, we must at least briefly consider early efforts by Rome to create lists or syllabi of modern errors. This is of some consequence to our story. Now, one caveat. It's not my intention to pass judgment on these syllabi and lists as regards their content, at least not their substantive merit. It will suffice to show how they positioned the church to fashion two distinct responses to modernity, and how Thomism was drawn into the different orbits of this question. Catholicism was not, as commonly depicted, dragged kicking and screaming into modern times. For several centuries, Catholicism was comfortably, perhaps all too comfortably, adapted to many aspects of modernity. Beginning with the discovery of the New World and the projection of Catholic missions onto 4 continents, many Catholics, clerical and lay, understood that they lived in a new era, an era of exploration, industry, education, art, vernacular literatures, new devotions, science, and philosophy. The Reformation and religious wars culminating in the treaties of Westphalia in 1648 destroyed the medieval common law of Christendom by creating a system of states having diverse confessional allegiances. Innocent X declared Westphalia null, void, invalid, iniquitous, unjust, damnable, reprobate, inane, and empty of meaning and effect for all time. He didn't like it. And it's still in the books. Even so, a new common law evolved among the peoples under Catholic rule. This was the first Catholic modernity. It was built upon a complex and evolving set of treaties, informal agreements, and legal fictions through which the Church conceded to Catholic sovereigns rights and obligations over many aspects of ecclesiastical life, in exchange for which the sovereigns protected the Church from schism and supplied the material resources for governance, especially for the far-flung missions in the New World. The sovereigns were deemed junior apostles and entitled to rule in trust the daily life of the Church in Europe and many of her colonies. So despite Innocent X's declaration that Westphalia was empty of meaning and effect for all time, on the ground, Catholicism developed a remarkable symbiosis with the new system of sovereignty, so long as it was in the hands of Catholic families. In fact, the modern state was assembled within the Catholic world, not the Protestant world. The modern state was assembled on the Iberian Peninsula post-1492. It required a deep and extensive cooperation of ecclesiastical and civil authorities. To the very end, on the eve of the French Revolution, this modernity was not perceived as a special problem by Catholics. Now, I'm not going to try here to cover all of these earlier centuries, what I call the first modernity of Catholicism. But one story might suffice to convey something of its mindset and its texture. On December 15, 1781, Pope Pius VI dispatched from Rome a courier carrying a secret letter to be delivered to the papal nuncio, to the Emperor of the Romans, Joseph II. The letter announced the Pope's intention to visit Vienna in 2 months' time to treat with the Emperor on issues of ecclesiastical jurisdiction and several disputes over territories in the north of Italy. The Crown Cardinal from France, Cardinal de Bernis, warned that the Pope would give the signal of a paper war with which much stronger governments, and thus would give birth to a discussion which the very interest of religion requires him to avoid. What was a paper war? It's a question we have to ask en route to Pascendi. In sum, a paper war included lists of complaints and errors tending to disturb the common law of Christendom. A serious paper war erupted during the reign of Louis XIV, who induced popes to issue some 6 bulls against the Jansenists, the most famous being Unigenitus in 1713, which condemned some 101 propositions extracted from Quesnel's Moral Reflections on the New Testament. It proved disastrous. The first effort of listing these errors was disastrous. It not only impeached the moral authority of the papacy, but also the stability of the French crown, and finally the Jesuits, who eventually would be expelled from France in 1764 and suppressed by the papacy itself in 1773. The French Revolution's civil constitution of the clergy unilaterally overturned this modern common law of Catholic Christendom. Church governance was handed not over to the mischievous but familiar Catholic families, but was instead given to the nation. The clergy became civil servants elected by democratic vote. This model spread to the former colonies, particularly in Latin America. Rights once belonging to the church had been transferred to kings and now to the nation. The state was no longer governed by anointed laity, but by a new doctrine of laicism. In 1818, Chateaubriand and Joseph de Bonald founded the journal The Conservative, introducing the term conservative into the political idiom of European politics. What was to be conserved? There was more than one answer. Politically, the thing to be conserved was the first modernity, the modern relationship between throne and altar that evolved after the religious wars. Thus, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 attempted to restore the union of throne and altar, hoping to contain, if not defeat, the forces of anarchy. In Rome, Pope Pius VII established in 1801 the Congregation of Extraordinary Affairs. It became a kind of kitchen cabinet that oversaw relations between Rome and the civil powers after the Restoration. Rome simply went into an emergency mode, resolved to handle the church-state crises on an ad hoc basis. But it also signaled there would be no overarching doctrine to meet the crisis. There would be no further paper wars. Encyclicals of the era simply encouraged Catholics to obey legitimate authority, beginning with the Pope's own temporal authority in the Papal States. Now, I'm not going to go through how this system unraveled, but it certainly did unravel, and it led to the restoration of a paper war. The syllabus of errors. The syllabus of errors stood on a very simple fact of political history. In 1816, Pius IX lost his Italian dominions to the House of Savoy, which installed not merely a lay state, but a laicist state. The Restoration was defunct. Pius's Secretary of State, Cardinal Antonelli, confided to a British envoy that exclusively Catholic governments had virtually ceased to exist. The triumph of the Italian Risorgimento had the unintended effect, however, of removing any inhibition of the papacy to speak on matters political. But how should it speak? There had been no systematic political theology for more than 2 centuries, virtually since the school at Salamanca. Pius IX and his advisors simply cobbled together a number of pontifical statements and admonitions, grouped them under different headings, and fired away. Attached to the encyclical Quanta Cura, the syllabus lists some 80 propositions. They're confusing because almost every erroneous proposition is stated in the affirmative. The reader must negate the affirmative proposition. So, for example, the proposition number 80 states that the Roman pontiff ought to reconcile himself to contemporary liberalism, the negation of which might be the Pope is not obliged to reconcile himself to contemporary liberalism, but it could also be the Pope is not obliged to reconcile himself to this or that brand of liberalism, or not obliged to reconcile himself to liberalism as it's understood today. Indeed, the search for a proper set of negations became very important to the Church's response to the problems of the mid-19th century. From the outset of this affair of the syllabus, churchmen understood the problem of promulgating lists of errors. Catholic journals, including the Dublin Review, considered republishing the syllabus as a set of negative propositions. In France, there was talk of making a new catechism out of the syllabus, prompting the Minister of Public Worship to decree, January 1st, 1865, that the syllabus could not be addressed from the pulpit. Felix Dupanloup, Bishop of Orléans, argued for a sensible principle of interpretation. He contended that the erroneous propositions listed in the syllabus should be read as liberal theses, that is, liberal universals. A false theory, when turned into a universal principle, is bound to be bad in a great number of cases, and for that reason must be repudiated, negated. Take proposition number 42 from the syllabus. In the case of conflicting laws enacted by 2 powers, civil law prevails. Well, this is not always true, and therefore must be negated. Or take proposition 39. The state, as being the origin and source of all rights, is endowed with a certain right not circumscribed by any limits. This proposition is never true, and therefore ought to be negated. But, alas, Dupanloup's method required considerable sophistication. The ordinary person had to keep fixed in his mind that the syllabus lists liberal theses rather than Catholic doctrines, and then had to go in search of just the right negation. By the way, the entire debate that goes all the way up to Vatican II over the thesis hypothesis comes out of this problem, because the effort of primarily the Society of Jesus to turn the affirmative propositions into negative propositions means that the affirmative proposition is the Catholic thesis. And so then it begins to look as though the We have Catholic theses. We consider the liberal principles and decide whether we have to adjust or change the Catholic thesis. Despite such confusions, however, Pius IX clearly set forth the purposes and targets of the syllabus. At the beginning of the encyclical, he notes that all of the errors, so listed, are opposed to the eternal natural law engraven by God in men's hearts, and to right reason, from which almost all other errors have their origin. The chief harm, he says, is to the good of human society. The ideologues of state power intended nothing less than to raise the foundations of the Catholic religion and of civil society. Well, note, this is not a disciplinary encyclical on matters ad intra. Rather, it is firmly anchored in the political questions following the revolutions of 1848. It would be difficult to imagine a more extroverted encyclical than Quanta Cura with its syllabus. For our purposes, three things are important, and each supports our thesis that the social political problem came first. First, among the syllabus's 80 propositions, only 7 are not directly related to the issue of church and state, but also by implication, marriage, family, education, sodalities, and so forth. Second, only 4 are culled from papal statements prior to the revolutions of 1848. This is a fact of some consequence because it indicates that Pius IX and his editors knew that they were entering a new situation. Third, the core of the document, Propositions 19 to 55, laid waste to the older common law of Christendom, namely the modern one. In proposition after proposition, Pius IX flatly denies the rights once exercised by Catholic sovereigns and now by nation states. He declares, in effect, the independence of the Church, not only in matters of ordinary government, such as sacraments and episcopal order, but also with regard to schools, religious orders, marriage, family, sodalities, seminaries. 5 years later, parts of the syllabus were reworked into 5 chapters and 21 canons of the first draft of Vatican I's document De Ecclesia Christi. If these canons were conjoined to the doctrine of universal jurisdiction of the Pope, the net effect would amount to something like a one-way separation of the Catholic Church from the states. As it turned out, the chapters and canons drawn from the syllabus had to be dropped because the bishops could not agree on any overarching theory to unify them. And if truth be known, they were also scared to go back to their home governments and be thrown in jail. In July 1870, they simply gave the papacy universal jurisdiction and went home. When Leo XIII was elected in 1878, he inherited an incomplete revolution. Unlike the time of Trent, he had no full set of conciliar doctrines. He had no new catechism. And none of this revolution had been canonically codified, which won't happen until 1917. Leo had inherited a fact or a deed rather than a coherent doctrine of political matters. Therefore, it fell to Leo to put 3 things into some sort of synthesis. First, the syllabus of errors with its 80 propositions, which had to be converted not merely into negations, but those negations had to be converted once again into an adequate political or social doctrine. Second, Vatican I's Constitution Dei Filius, ratified unanimously in the spring of 1870. This document asserted that God is the Lord of sciences, that faith and reason have distinct objects and ends which are mutually supportive, and that the assent of faith is by no means a blind movement of the mind. In other words, the preambles of the faith needed to be clarified and organized for modern times. Third, he had inherited from the council the power to directly teach the Catholic world without interference of state churches. And because Leo was a prisoner in the Vatican, his entire papacy, he had plenty of time to try to synthesize these. The question was how to put these 3 together. His answer, in part, was to bring his Perusian Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas to Rome and to make 2 of its faculty, one of whom was his brother, cardinals. A year later, he issued Aeterni Patris. In Aeterni Patris, Leo insisted that a sound philosophy is needed in order that sacred theology may receive the nature, form, and genius of a true science. The faith-reason issues highlighted in De Filius, 1870, could not be maintained or advanced on the basis of philosophical eclecticism. Leo complained that since the 16th century, philosophical systems had multiplied beyond measure, and that even Catholic philosophers accommodated themselves to a system which depends upon the authority and choice of any professor. His remark about 16th century innovators might be construed as a warning shot fired in the direction of the Baroque-era scholastics, especially the Suarezans. But this is not true. In fact, Leo praises the schools of the 16th century scholasticism, calling them homes of human wisdom. And he explicitly recognized that Thomis's thought, quote, was unfolded in good time by later masters and with a goodly yield. It is true, however, that Aeterni Patris cannot be read on its own terms as an exhortation to a merely generic scholasticism. Thomas is held out as the master, and Leo did not hesitate to admonish churchmen that nearly all of the founders and lawgivers of the religious orders commanded their members to study and religiously adhere to the teaching of St. Thomas. Thomas's doctrine, he said, should enjoy excellence over all the others. Leo did not attempt a chart of authentic rivulets of interpretation, much less did he make a list of the polluted ones. But it's clear enough that he believed that there is an authentic Thomism. That is, those rivulets of interpretation through the schools could be measured against the original. But my main point is that if you read Aeterni Patris as a whole, we find that Leo framed the revival of Christian philosophy chiefly in the context of the ongoing political problems. Quote, "Whosoever turns his attention to the bitter strifes these days and seeks a reason for the troubles that vex public and private life must come to the conclusion that false conclusions concerning divine and human things, which originated in the schools of philosophy, have now crept into the orders of the state." When Leo enumerates the benefits of reviving scholastic philosophy, more particularly the philosophy of Thomas, he first speaks of the social political issues and kindred subjects, and then of the advance of the physical sciences. It can't be doubted that the Leonine revival was motivated first by the search for an ongoing social and political doctrine. In the years before Aeterni Patris, Leo's mentors were using Thomas for just this purpose. The Jesuits on the editorial staff of La Civiltà Cattolica, founded in 1850 to respond to the political and cultural crisis of the Risorgimento, had already begun to cut this groove. Luigi Tapparelli first sketched his theories of social justice and subsidiarity in the cockpit of that journal. His colleague Matteo Liberatore would become very influential for the encyclical Aeterni Patris, became one of Leo's trusted advisors and a member of the Roman Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. But Liberatore actually converted to Thomism after joining the staff of Civiltà Cattolica. In other words, he came to Thomism through the crucible of the social and political issues. And finally, there's the evidence of Leo's own work. In some 110 encyclicals and other teaching letters, Thomas is rarely discussed or referenced apart from the social political problems. So these two aims, the systematic and pedagogical, and on the other hand, the search for an adequate social and political doctrine, were not without tension. Leo's metaphor of a fountain of doctrine dispersed through certain rivulets required an important and subtle distinction. In those subjects having propinquity to sacred doctrine, it's crucial to achieve a tightly organized account of the relationship between philosophy and the deposit of faith. Even slight changes in the philosophy will entail new estimations of the doctrine. If Thomas is to be the master on such things, the relationship between the rivulets of interpretation and the source is not something about which the church could be indifferent. However, on the bevy of issues which swarm around the social political problem, the terrain allowed much more room for creative maneuver. Thomas himself taught that the natural law can change by addition. The very nature of the subject allows a broad threshold in which principle and prudence conjoin to deliver a suitable conclusion. To be sure, there is an overlap between these two foci. Metaphysical truths about divine providence, the ordination of the soul to a final end, the intelligibility of the good, to mention only a few, stand in both registers. Fundamental issues of anthropology are always Janus-faced, looking in one direction toward the preambles of the faith and in another direction toward practical applications in the history of political and economic institutions. Leo wanted Thomism to guide both of these endeavors, but even Leo understood that the political and social vector had a developmental aspect distinct from the metaphysical issues constituting the preambles of the faith. Now, it's not merely coincidental that the recently restored Society of Jesus became a kind of sluice gate for Leo's quest to develop a new social and political doctrine based upon Thomistic principles. Let's briefly consider why. After their founding in 1610, the Jesuit Ratio Studiorum prescribed the study of St. Thomas. Although the constitutions of the society forbade Jesuits from staffing faculties of law, it left them completely free to teach and to publish on the deeper issues of jurisprudence and political philosophy. Thus began the first systematic modern schooling of Thomas's De Legibus. It happened because the Jesuits couldn't teach law as a practical discipline. They could only teach it philosophically and theologically. Some 300 years after they were written, Thomas's questions on law were excavated, propounded in lectures, summarized in textbooks, and applied not only to casuitical problems, but more importantly, to the most controversial issues of the time. Bellarmine, Mariana, Molina, Suarez, and a host of lesser lights made extensive and astute investigations of political order, economics, and the relations between church and state. Like all schools of thought, this neo-Thomism eventually declined in vigor and creativity. Among other reasons, the Baroque-era Jesuits sailed too close to the shores of politics. In 1547, the books of Bellarmine and Vittoria were put on the index, only temporarily, for suggesting that the Pope did not enjoy de jure direct power in matters temporal. But Jesuits more often ran afoul of Catholic sovereigns by speculating that the political authority is vested inchoately in the body politic, and that the original form of government was by nature democratic, that there are in principle plural forms of legitimate government, this in the time of absolute monarchy. Indeed, they argued that heathen peoples have a natural capacity and right of self-governance, rights that include not only standing at private law, but also at international law. But most importantly, the Jesuits were the first to understand and to discuss in print the potentially subversive idea that the modern common law of Catholic Christendom was weakly founded, because the principle of absolutism was not suitable for addressing either the church-state problems in Europe or the problems that were cropping up in the colonization abroad. After 1860, however, when Rome had nothing to lose by discussing politics, the political theory of these Baroque-era Thomists looked like manna from heaven. This was exactly what was needed to make a coherent political philosophy out of the syllabus of errors. They went back 300 years and excavated the Jesuit critique of absolute monarchy and simply applied it to the laicist states of the mid-19th century. Thus, there emerged a kind of broad Thomism suitable for the political and social issues. When Leo spoke of these rivulets, which are derived from the fount of the angelic doctor, it was often the rivulets that seemed especially important. And in this respect, there is some truth to Lord Acton's claim that Thomas was the first Whig. What he should have said is that the Thomists were Whiggish because they developed rather freewheeling interpretations of the master on disputed issues of political, economic, legal, and social order, and they showed considerable ingenuity in making their adaptations look continuous with the work of the angelic doctor. Now, none of this should suggest that Leo or his advisors were uninterested in the authentic teachings of Thomas on matters social and political. While Leo never made a list of core doctrines, there were certain principles that framed what could count as plausible interpretations. Chief among these were the teaching on the eternal law, the participation in that law by natural reason, the harmony of faith and reason, the twofold order of providence, the priority of intellect to the will in practical reasoning, the common good as the measure of the political order, and the penultimacy of political society, and a few others. All of these had the solid foundation in Thomas. So equipped with only a few principles properly delineated and connected, one could go on to make considerable headway in developing a social doctrine. We should also bear in mind that this sector of the Leonine program did not have as its aim to produce a pure Thomism, to which social doctrine could be appended as so many conclusions. Rather, it was a quest lasting over several pontificates for a social doctrine, not for a Thomistically pure one. Moving from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, the problems continued to change along with the political, legal, and economic facts on the ground. Thomism was a resource for that project, but not its purpose. Convinced that a new social and political doctrine was long overdue, Leo gave his Thomists permission to do four things. First, to resurrect the doctrine of plural legitimate forms of regimes. This was the sore spot of the Baroque tradition, and in Leo's time, it was still a neuralgic issue for the remnants of the Catholic right wing, particularly in France. Second, he gave them permission to speculatively re-engage the so-called translation theory of authority, according to which God, by the natural law, vests authority originally, though inchoately, in the body politic. This seemed to be a promising way to give a scholastic foundation to political consent and brought the Thomist tradition to the vestibule of democratic theory. Leo himself did not officially take a position one way or the other on the matter, but he made it clear that he would not rule out the so-called translation theory. Third, he gave his Thomists permission to integrate natural law and natural rights. Fourth, he gave his Thomists permission to do an analysis of historical change and the role of historical change in the prudence of state-making. All of these matters were discussed in Leo's own encyclicals, but this vector of thought was completed in the work of a generation of thinkers who were born in the waning years of his pontificate: Luigi Sturzo, Jacques Maritain, Charles Journet, Heinrich Raman, Yves Simon, John Courtney Murray. So, Leo was engaged in a new kind of paper war. He took the outmoded structure of the medieval scholastic article, for example, what we find in the Summa Theologiae, with the question, the objections, the sed contra, the response, the replies to objections. Then he changed the questions and rebuilt the article in the prose of an encyclical teaching. It was in part dialectic, in part systematic, in part apologetic. There was no need to make lists of errors that left Catholics scratching their heads about what had to be affirmed or negated. For example, if we take the most controversial proposition of Pius IX's syllabus, the Roman pontiff can and ought to reconcile himself and come to terms with progress, liberalism, and recent civilization, we convert it into a negation. The Roman pontiff need not reconcile himself with progress, liberalism, and recent civilization. The negation then is then converted into an affirmation. By natural right, workers and their families may justly claim to organize and to bargain for living wages, the doctrines of laissez-faire liberalism notwithstanding. Presto, we have Rerum Novarum. All of Leo's major encyclicals on social and political issues should be read in just this fashion. He begins with a question, surveys the authorities, affirms the harmony of faith and reason, then goes on to construct a teaching on the question at hand. His response to the political and social aspects of modernity proved rather successful. For one thing, there was no living memory of a pope doing this kind of work, namely doing something more than issuing ad hoc complaints or making lists of errors. Leo took the politically subversive questions of the Enlightenment, brought them within the purview of Catholic tradition, where they were corrected and harmonized with Catholic truth. The underlying scholastic doctrine gave this body of work at least the appearance of coherence. And as Leo's successors, both lay and clerical scholars, continued the project, there emerged a remarkably structured but evolving body of social doctrine, in many respects more sophisticated than that of its secular rivals. But this now brings us back to Pascendi, into our overarching theme of the two modernisms, two Thomisms. Pius X immediately went back into the mode of making lists of errors. Lamentabili Sane listed 65 errors. He also referenced the encyclical Auctorum Fidei, 1794, which condemned a list of another 85 propositions in connection with Jansenism, in this case, political Jansenism. A scrupulous scholar under ecclesiastical discipline now found himself reckoning with 150 propositions, some of which were in the affirmative, some of which were in the negative. And if we include the syllabus of errors, 230 erroneous propositions. Who could keep track of all these errors? Indeed, this is exactly what Leo's magisterium tried to avoid. Charity of interpretation requires us to concede that Leo had the advantage of dealing with a different sector of liberalism, and in Catholic affairs with a different species of liberal. Montalembert, Lacordaire, Lamennais, through his mid-career before he defected, and Rosmini were liberal but pro-papal. Montalembert's most famous work was his multi-volume Monks of the West, dedicated to Pope Pius IX. He was hardly a Hans Kung in the making. These men had no interest in impeaching the deposit of sacred doctrine or of appealing to history in order to suggest a profound discontinuity in theology proper. Pius X was dealing with an entirely different kind of cat who resented the post-1870 Roman authority, emancipated from civil and democratic control, and who rejected not only Leo's Thomism, but scholasticism itself. Leo also had the advantage of focusing upon the institutional survival of the church, as well as the array of social institutions clustered around it. Even though it had taken more than 300 years to develop an adequate political or social doctrine, once Rome recovered its bearings, this task played to the strong suit of the church, that is, to church unity against external threats. More often than not, the misbehavior of the nation-states only reinforced the perception among Catholics and many non-Catholics that Leo's teachings were well measured. Clearly, this was an easier battle than tracking down heretical professors in one's own seminaries, where the church would seem to play the role of the bully. The Oath Against Modernism, 1910, and the institution of committees of vigilance at the parish levels certainly distracted attention from the serious theological issues discussed in Pascendi. Pius X turned inward and fixed upon this other set of issues that stood close to sacred doctrine. In Lamentabili, only 6 of the 65 propositions remotely touch upon the social questions. In Pascendi, we find perhaps 3 paragraphs in the sphere of social and political thought. For Pius X, the synthesis of all heresies was a different sort of modernism. And at least in the sphere of sacred doctrine, the metaphysical principles conjoined to it by way of preambles, there could be no compromise, nor could there be a development analogous to what was already underway in the social teaching. Inevitably now, Thomism is split in 2 directions. It's on the offensive in social thought, but it's now in a defensive role, not only with regard to the deployment of its philosophical theology, but also in terms of ecclesiastical discipline. Some of the impetus for this internal discipline arose from questions never settled by Leo. In the first year of his pontificate, Pius X sent a brief to the Roman Academy of St. Thomas, noting that Leo's plan for installing Thomism in the seminaries was not moving along satisfactorily. Institutional resistance began not with the modernists, but you can guess, the Society of Jesus. And this began during Leo's own pontificate. 4 years after Aeterni Patris, at their 23rd General Congregation, the Jesuits pledged their allegiance to the plan of the encyclical, but at the same time expressed esteem for their own scholastics and masters such as Suarez. A decade later, the general of the society, Louis Martin, inquired whether Jesuit teachers were required to follow Thomas's real distinction between essence and the active existence of creatures. Leo replied that the Society's constitutions required the teaching of Thomas's doctrine, though he added that adherence to the angelic doctor did not imply any lack of esteem for the erudition and profundity of the Jesuit doctors. This was a delicate situation indeed, for in the sphere of social, political, and legal thought, the Baroque-era Jesuit thinkers provided all of these useful resources for the development of a political theory. Moreover, in the minds of some of Leo's own teachers and colleagues were more than a little tinctured with Suarezism. But social doctrine was not the problem. Rather, at issue was the unity of the metaphysical theses constituting the preambles of the faith. And Leo made his mind clear. Seminarians were not to be trained in plural metaphysical systems, which meant plural Thomisms. So Pius intended to supply something more than mere exhortation. The sure sign of modernism was derogation from or disparagement of scholasticism. Quote, whether it is ignorance or fear, or both, that inspires this conduct in them, certain it is that the passion for novelty is always united in them with a hatred of scholasticism. And there is no surer sign that a man is tending to modernism than when he begins to show his dislike for the scholastic method, unquote. To be heard carpendo, at scholasticism, was ground for dismissing either faculty or administrators in ecclesiastical schools. Lest there be any doubt what was meant by scholasticism, Pius X issued a motu proprio, Doctoris Angelici, putting Thomistic norm for studies in degree-granting ecclesiastical schools, explicitly under precept from the Holy See. In order to curb private opinion of professors, Pius ordered that the text of the Summa Theologiae be used as the text of the lectures, and that all professorial comments be restricted to Latin. To slow the professors down, I think, was the point of that. Or if they were teaching something that was a wrong rivulet, no one would understand it anyway at that point. Understanding how unlikely it would be that the entirety of the Summa could be so taught, Pius added, it goes without saying that our intention was to be understood as referring, above all, to those principles on which the philosophy is based as its foundations. These principles, fundaments, or what he called capita, are not to be placed in the category of opinions capable of being debated one way or the other. Importantly, none of the social and political issues, which were already being vigorously debated and expounded, appear among the principles targeted in this motu proprio. After the motu proprio, a few weeks later, virtually on the eve of Pius's death, Cardinal Lorenzelli, prefect of the Sacred Congregation of Studies, published a list of 24 theses. These include, at the outset of the list, an affirmation of the divine being as pure act, in contrast to admixture of potency and creatures. They comprise metaphysical theses of just the sort that Pius X said cannot be placed in the category of opinions to be debated. Everyone at the time understood that the 24 theses were aimed in the direction of Suarez, beginning with the doctrine of the real distinction between essence and existence, which was not generally held by the Suarezans. Advisors who labored on the list did in fact worry that another summary list of truths or corresponding errors would be received as a compendium and might suggest that Thomistic principles are to be found only within the four corners of the list. Still other churchmen worried that a new list would appear to be a piece of propaganda that might impugn the seriousness and authority of St. Thomas. But when Pius died on August 20, 1914, there were two Thomisms. One broadly devised and oriented to social questions, the other narrow in consisting of these capita, which could not be debated. For example, it's a wonderful example. In 1917, there was planned an international congress in Grenada, celebrating the third centenary of the death of Suarez. The Catholic press noted that the 24 theses, from 3 years previously, had impeached the reliability of Suarez on certain questions of metaphysics. Moreover, the newly drafted and soon-to-be promulgated Code of Canon Law required those in charge of religious and clerical formation to teach the principles of the angelic doctor and to hold to them religiously. The Congress in Grenada did not juridically fall under these disciplinary decretals, but it was an awkward moment nonetheless. and how did they solve it? Rome recommended that the Congress focus upon the social, political, and international law aspects of Suarez's thought, because on these matters one is permitted to avow an evolving line of thought and to celebrate its utility in handling modern problems. In any case, in the summer of 1914, it was clear that the intramural disputes among Thomists had been brought into the modernist controversy, and popes soon began to have second thoughts about this strange and potentially crippling consequence. Beginning with Benedict XV, they were unwilling to strictly enforce Pius X's official Thomism within the seminaries and the ranks of the religious orders. While the exhortations of Leo and the precepts of Pius X were duly noted by Benedict XV and his successors, rigorous enforcement proved to be the exception rather than the rule. Only 5 months after Pius's death, Benedict conceded that there is room for divergent opinions, so long as they constitute no harm to faith or discipline, so long as they're expressed with due moderation. He explicitly warned that no one should take upon himself the role of impugning the orthodoxy of others or of affixing the stigma of disloyalty to faith or to discipline. His successors adopted the same policy, insisting on the normativity of Thomas in re metaphysica, while at the same time quietly acting to prevent this in-house educational system from becoming politically suffocating. But even this prudent policy could not remove the sense among faculty and students that once you move into the systematic area, you must move very carefully. But there was one further factor at work, which I'll mention in conclusion. With the disaster of the Great War and the rise of the totalitarian regimes, the papacy's attention was funneled back into the social and political issues. The shift of magisterial attention back to the political aspects of modernity is quite evident during the pontificate of Pius XI. In Studiorum Ducem, 1923, Pius XI extolled the virtues of Thomas. Quote, "It will be sufficient, perhaps, to point out that Thomas wrote under the inspiration of the supernatural spirit which animated his life and writings, which contained the principles of and the laws governing all sacred studies, and are said to possess a universal character." He approvingly quotes Pius X's admonition there must be no deviation from Thomas' praesertum in re metaphysica, and he clearly reiterates the conviction that the organization and presentation of sacred doctrine require the preambles or reasons for belief drawn from philosophy. But what is most striking about Studiorum Ducem is Pius XI's interest in the social and political issues. In fact, he emphasizes Thomas's contributions, quote, in the science of morals, in sociology and law, by laying down sound principles of legal, social, commutative, and distributive justice, and explaining the relations between justice and charity. He continues, Thomas also composed a substantial moral theology, capable of directing all human acts in accordance with the supernatural last end of man. And, as he is, as we have said, the perfect theologian, so he gives infallible rules and precepts of life not only for individuals, but also for civil and domestic society. Hence those superb chapters in the second part of the Summa Theologica on paternal or domestic government, the lawful power of the state or the nation, natural and international law, peace and war, justice and property, laws and the obedience they command, the duty of helping individual citizens in their need, and cooperating with all to secure the prosperity of the state, both in the natural and supernatural order. If these principles were religiously and inviolably observed in private life and in public affairs, and in the duties of mutual obligation between nations, nothing else would be required to secure mankind that peace of Christ and the kingdom of Christ, which the world so ardently longs for. It is therefore wished that the teachings of Aquinas, more especially praesertum explicando, involve his exposition of international law and the laws governing the mutual relations of peoples, and become more studied, for it contains the foundations of a genuine League of Nations, unquote. So, while adhering to Pius X's prescriptions, he returns to the Leonine project of what especially needs to be explicated. Interestingly, it's not the prima pars with its metaphysical armature, but rather the secunda pars of the Summa on human conduct. And this line of thought is repeated again in Divini Ilius Magistri, which takes up the problem of education. Here, Pius recommends Luigi Tapparelli's work on natural right. On balance, Pius held together these two modernisms, but with the broad and synthetic Leonine approach to the social and political issues put front and center, because he believed that political modernism was not rendered defunct by the Great War. In fact, in his first encyclical, Pius distinguished two modernisms. It's where I got the title from. Quote, "There is a species of moral, legal, and social modernism which we condemn no less decidedly than we condemn the theological modernism," unquote. And as the political crises mounted in Europe and in Latin America, Pius XI gave a certain cachet to this broad Thomism by canonizing Robert Bellarmine in 1931 and making him a doctor of the church the following year. It was Bellarmine's social and political thought that was held up as exemplary for the church's struggle against state absolutism. Some conclusions. We set out to show how Thomas's thought was resurrected and put into play with respect to problems posed by political modernity, and then by the philosophical and theological issues related to modernism. We looked at these two foci primarily from the standpoint and documents of the Roman Magisterium. All of this would have to be delineated at a more detailed and complete level. But if my narrative is generally correct, we can draw four conclusions. The first two would seem to follow almost directly from the exposition. The second two are more hypothetical. First, the Roman attempt to issue syllabi and lists of errors and truths did not necessarily achieve the results for which the lists were designed. Whether in response to political or philosophical modernity, from the early lists in the Jansenist controversy, such as Unigenitus, through the syllabus of errors, and then up to Lamentabili, and then the 24 Theses. These lists sparked confusions. On balance, the Leonine practice of encyclical teaching was more effective, both ad extra and ad intra. Second, the list-making approach did not play to the strong suit of Thomism, which requires not only definitions and conclusions, but also a deeply textured set of questions and distinctions. The ever-changing historical events, post-1789 types of questions, could hardly be answered just by referring to Thomas's treatment of political matters in the 13th century. These questions had been glossed for several decades of scholastic commentary, and after the election of Leo by the tradition of papal encyclicals. Skill in this area required one to know Thomas and Aristotle, the commentators, new applications formed in the crucible of magisterial teachings. And as we explained, this vector of social thought got a head start over the recovery of Thomas's metaphysics. For nearly a generation, therefore, the recovery of the metaphysics and the systematics for deployment in the curricula of schools had to play catch-up. And it had to do so while laboring under the disadvantage of trying to forge a consensus among different schools of Thomism, which had crystallized their opinions over the course of several centuries. These opinions, too, were hardened by loyalties within religious orders and their lay associates, and they were made purely radioactive after the disciplinary apparatus of Pius X. In social thought, however, the schooling of Thomism allowed more consensus because the material was permeable to the political ecclesiastical needs and policies of Leo and his successors. For their part, the metaphysical issues were extraordinarily complex and subtle. They're difficult on their own terms, never mind the practical questions of how to instantiate and enforce them in educational institutions. The 24 Theses were not strictly juridical in nature, but it was naive to think that they would not be so regarded. These theses tried to expose the deep veins of Thomas's metaphysics, but these veins were much deeper than what faculty or students could have mastered even under the best conditions. A slight and passing familiarity with Thomas's system, usually acquired secondhand, and in this case in Latin, was almost bound to breed that kind of contempt that comes from knowing a little but not enough. Leo and his successors certainly wanted to keep Thomism in the intelligible order rather than in the merely canonical or disciplinary order. But just how to enkindle this Thomism as a living pattern of thought, and by what combination of exhortation and precept, proved to be a very difficult problem. So difficult, it seemed to have broken the back of the papacy in this area. Third, although it would take another essay to explore, it would be useful to ask, whether the official discipline, although duly relaxed after 1914, created disgruntlement within clerical ranks that lead to many of the problems of our times. Academicians began to question the need for philosophically organized preambles of the faith. Such dissatisfaction could take the route of wanting to make the preambles entirely a matter of theology and history. One could repair, for example, to the history of the early church, or to patristic thinking, or to the theory that Thomas's philosophy was simply a work of theology anyway. These lines of inquiry had the seeming advantage of bypassing not only the bewildering welter of medieval disputes, but also bypassing the forbidden zone of opinion carved out by the official Thomism. If you talk about Maximus the Confessor, you're home free. They also had the advantage of a thoroughly theological answer to modernity. It had the promise of a new and less philosophically constrained apologetics. As ecclesiastical discipline in the schools declined precipitously in the 50s and 1960s, and the drapes were removed, the drapes of discipline, systematic Thomism underwent a kind of defenestration. No longer privileged in the curriculum of either seminaries or Catholic schools, systematic Thomism became a historical specialty. And it's ironic because it was Pius X's own fear that the modernists, quote, wished the scholastic philosophy to be relegated to the history of philosophy, unquote. But after the curricular defenestration, that's just where it was deposited. The quest for a pure and official Thomism in systematic questions became a historical specialty, charged with responsibility to deliver, according to contemporary methods of research, just what Thomas said, but without any systematic or apologetical purpose for what he said. Fourth, the Thomistic contribution to social doctrine was never meant to be a complete Thomism, but rather an adaptation for the purposes at hand. Social doctrine had its own momentum, seemingly unaffected by the institutional demise of systematic Thomism. Almost everyone understood that the great encyclical teachings were wound together by various and sundry threads of Thomistic thinking. And for several decades, both progressives and conservatives could affirm the general profile of teachings on the common good, subsidiarity, social justice, and human rights. The gradual separation of the social doctrine from the overall system of Aquinas, however, began to create the impression that the philosophy of practical reason was freestanding, a kind of prima philosophia having no connection to the metaphysical system or having connection only by way of dotted lines. This could prove attractive not only for progressives, but also for moral conservatives as well. The frayed edges between metaphysics and practical reason was especially evident in diverse conceptions of natural law, a subject that became a kind of public reason detached from the Leonine teachings about participation in the eternal law, divine providence, and man's ultimate end, detached even from teleology and the rudiments of a philosophy of nature. These issues really do stand close to the preambles. Leo's revival made natural law a common coin of discourse and exposition. And given the fact that natural law thinking had gone into abeyance in Catholic thought during the 18th century, it was quite an accomplishment for Leo to have brought it back so late in the game of modern debates over political philosophy. But this coin came in different denominations. As early as 1930, Walter Farrell, the Dominican, took note of the fact that standard ecclesiastical textbooks on moral and social thought could contain as many 6 different opinions on natural law. Evidently, he remarked, it is time that some definite, well-established ideas be proposed on this subject, unquote. Farrell had detected that the chief term of social doctrine was being used very loosely and confusedly, and that it was necessary to locate the subject more securely in Thomas's own doctrine, including those metaphysical issues. So perhaps we should conclude that the Leonine and Pian insistence upon adherence to Thomas, prae certum in re metaphysica, turned out, after all, to be the more important issue. Leo certainly wanted to preserve a proper set of analogies and systematic connections between the two foci of metaphysics and politics. A century later, however, the secunda pars on human action is not always, in fact, rarely is it, integrated with the prima pars of the Summa. We need to only survey the chronic and significant differences of opinion over the systematic grounding of natural law today, and the extraordinarily complicated and controversial skirmish lines over issues of moral theology to see that this is so. As the legislated Thomism and metaphysics retreated, the issues of discipline and church authority migrated from metaphysics and the preambles of the faith over into sectors of practical reasoning, especially the life issues. But this is actually a strange upshot of the history. But it is not our aim here to complete this circle. I just tried to set out to show how different orbits of modernism and the Thomistic revival, how they began and how they developed both in and out of tandem through the Pascendi era. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Hittinger has graciously agreed to field some questions, even though we are at the stated end of the time for our session. We'll continue it further for a few moments at least, so he can take his own questions from the audience.
I wonder if you would be prepared to say anything about Dominic Prummer's 3-volume Latin manual on moral theology, which came out in 1960. Do you know well enough to say whether that's the case?
I can't offer an opinion because I have not looked at it. But why did you raise it? Is there something important?
It seems to me that in many ways Prummer tries to survey the water. I mean, it's 3 volumes, you know, with the fine print Latin, thesis, argument, distinction, etc. Taking into account, I think, a lot of the Salamancans. I don't know to what extent it would be Suarezian or not. But it's magisterial, at least in the sense of the scope, and I was just wondering if that was kind of like the last breath of the manuals before the Vatican Council.
It could be, but you know, by the 30s and 40s and 50s, people had moved out of those manuals into other kinds of textbooks.
I know they have.
Right, yeah.
It's interesting that this would still survive in 1960 as a publication that apparently was justified by seminaries. I couldn't guess what else would be the market for it.
Right. Tris.
But manualist-like volumes continue to be published in medical ethics. I mean, it all collapses really after Vatican II. And standing and looking at it from the outside, it seems to me, when said about the sociology of knowledge, you prescribe a whole lot of teachings to maintain a paradigm. A paradigm that emerges defining Roman Catholicism in the first scholasticism, the 13th century, then gets recast in modernity with the Reformation, Renaissance, the development of secular philosophical academies, and then gets defined with Trent, and it's an attempt to maintain it as any really complex social, political, ascetical, liturgical, because as Fleck describes what Kuhn steals from him, a Denkstiel, a Denkkollektiv. So all of the Roman Catholic popes are trying to maintain this, and then it just collapses totally, finally, when the manualists go away. So the end of the manualist tradition may be an index when the whole project of maintaining the paradigm collapses. So it seems to be tinkering with the paradigm. That kind of metaphor in the sociology of knowledge might be an apt way of looking how one address these various facets.
Of course, if I'm right, there was 2 kinds of tinkering.
Sure.
And that maybe I could summarize the thesis in this way. At the end of the day, the Roman magisterium thought that political modernity was more dangerous and fed the resources onto that front. And it's what persists even after the kind of embarrassment about the disciplinary apparatus. They go right back to that front as what has to be fought on.
I mean, the Orthodox metaphor, Orthodox want to be in the mind of the fathers. They want to think like someone in the first 3 centuries. What was going on here was to try to get someone in the mind of Thomas, or at least the second scholasticism. And people realized it was much more important, perhaps, how you structured social political action, not the
Well, you see, 1870 is a different kind of council than Trent, besides the fact that they only had time to ratify 2 documents. But it's a different kind of council. It's the more radical council because it tries to, in modern times, make effective the Gregorian reforms of the 12th century. It tries to separate the church from the state, one-way separation. And the cluster of problems that go around with 1870, right? It's natural that the Thomists, this revival of scholastic philosophy, would be concerned with those. Unlike Trent, they don't have a full menu of systematic theological issues to deal with, which have to be put into a certain kind of an order. They just don't have that to work with.
Trent got to meet again and again and again, and Vatican I turned out to just be a stopgap.
Right. And I think also, it's just in human nature, you do what you can win at. And Leo taught the Thomists, on social issues, you can win. And there was at least the appearance of being able to bring back doctrines of natural law, common good, subsidiarity, these kind of things. And actually, your secular counterparts begin to fumble their own arguments. I mean, this was a great recovery. It worked really well for a number of pontificates. So it's like, why run the ball when you can throw it down the field?
Maybe not the best metaphor this year here.
Yes, yes. In which you can't do either at Notre Dame anymore.
Russ, there's one more question over here, too, if you get a chance.
Yes, yes, Father.
This point you brought up that the very thing that Pius was afraid of as far as Thomism getting regulated to a point of history, or in a historical sense. Would you say that that would definitely not have happened if Pius X, wouldn't have gone out hard on the syllabus, or you're just saying that was just simply a point that came up on that?
Well, we don't know how it would have happened. But my opinion is Leo had worked up a head of steam by getting out of the game of making the lists, and that modern encyclical teaching is meant to be an alternative to the lists. It's self-consciously meant to be that. So that we're not going to list them. We're going to actually do a bit of philosophizing within the encyclical. Now, he had worked up a head of steam in that mentality, and that we can answer modern challenges doing it this way. So that when Pius went back to the list making, he was abandoning the deepest part of the Leonine project, in my view. But, unfortunately for Thomism, right, he made the Thomists the carabinieri fidei on this thing. I mean, they had to be the policemen on these lists. I believe it really took the steam out of what Leo had let loose, from which I don't think it ever recovered. Anyway.
And would that also be one of the reasons why Vatican II then did the council the way it was done, was because of that issue, those issues from the last century, and in other words, to not list things in any kind of negative way, but a much different
Right.
feel of the council.
Absolutely. And look what persists after Vatican II, that's still in continuity with Leo, is the encyclical tradition. That is, if an important issue comes up, don't make the list. Stop. Even if you're like JP2, you write many volumes in each encyclical, right? So that has persisted. They learned that much. Also, you have to remember that the theologians of Vatican II were the ones who were sitting in the classrooms where you could not be caught carping. They were loaded they had their guns loaded by the late 50s on that. And look, we can't forget about Humani Generis in Pius XII. It did look as though they were the bullies, the Thomistic police. And they went after greatly beloved thinkers in the Jesuit order and others, and they were loaded for bear. My belief is that just what Leo was trying to prevent. He was trying to make the Thomistic revival something kind of sexy. It was new. There were novelties in it. That was its whole cachet. And I think Pius spilled the beans there. Pius XI comes right back to try to reconnect with Leo. He had the same teachers and colleagues as Leo did in Rome. But he surveys the situation and says, I'm not going to touch those metaphysical theses. It's crazy. They're radioactive. So I'm going to go back to the part that was really clearly worked with Leo. And I'm just going to issue encyclical after encyclical on social doctrine.
I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to have a break. So those of you who still want to talk with Professor Hittinger, he will, I trust, be consent to be cornered. Thank him once again. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Let me corner you very quickly. Very quick question.
I'm sorry it was so long.